Hello, everyone. I just wanted to check in with you because we're a little behind, but we have the final panelist, and I'm delighted to say that here is Juan Cartagena. So I'm going to give him a round of applause. Yes, perfect timing. Okay, so we're going to start in a couple minutes.
What happened?
Bless you. Well, okay, everyone. Good evening. Thank you very much. And welcome to The Color Line in the 21st Century, the ongoing effect of race, punishment, and exclusion in the United States. My name's Kimberly Westcott, and I'm Associate Counsel at the Community Service Society, and I'll be moderating this conversation with an impressive panel that includes Professor Gloria J. Brown-Marshall with John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Yes, give her a hand. Juan Cartagena, President and CEO of Latino Justice. Yeah. David R. Jones, President and CEO of the Community Service Society. Wonderful. Assemblymember Walter Mosley, who represents the 57th District in the state of New York. And Brittany Packnett, who's with Campaign Zero. That's an affiliate of Black Lives Matter, and she's also an executive director with Teach for America in St. Louis, Missouri. So thank you for being here. And so after we hear from the panel, we want to hear from you. And so when the panel is concluded, we're going to have everyone have an opportunity to share their ideas and their thoughts and their comments and their demands and their strategies and their solutions. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the Columbia University School of Social Work for providing the space for this evening's event. Back in 1898, CSS organized a summer course in social work that would serve as a foundation for establishing the School of Social Work. So it seemed right that the school should be the venue for this inaugural event. So I'd like to offer a few comments before we start. Until Black Lives Matter, the broader context of institutional racism was absent from mainstream accounts. Like the Dark Ages, it was communicated as a form of secret history, a story largely untold about the systemic and very violent subordination of Black people in American society. From enslavement to Jim Crow to today's mass incarceration system, the criminalization of a people. Mainstream media did not want to tell the story. History books do not recount how stratification and race and violence are linked to the suffering in today's Black and brown communities. And until only recently, the scholars who did this work were relegated to alternative spaces like Black studies and Latino studies, a special place where the Academy let them have their say, but was in effect treated as the Black point of view. That's why Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, with all of its cell phone cameras and its tweets and its cross-commentary that circumvented the top-down establishment media, was such a revelation. The Black point of view is gradually seeping into the mainstream record. It appears on our smartphones, our computers. It's spoken about in coffee shops, and it's inspired writers like Ta-Nehisi Coates' historic account of systemic racism in this country. And we now see, across all vectors of well-being, economic, public health, environmental, from Ferguson to Flint, the dominant underlying factor is proving to be race. Many understand that justice as a form of social healing requires balance. The hallmark image of justice is the scales. It underscores that what was wrongfully taken from one should be returned to the other. Some say this requires wholesale targeted resources, reparations. Others believe it begins with a full recognition of Black humanity and suffering. Thanks to Black Lives Matter and other advocates, we're increasingly aware that the remedy for state-sanctioned violence transcends police reform. It moves beyond our current subsistence-level social welfare system to an affirmative demand for human rights, for education, housing, employment, healthcare, what we need to live. Thanks to the activists, we're not required to begin this discussion by connecting the dots of untold history. We don't have to be burdened by struggling to move the recognized scope of injury into today. Activists have unleashed a tsunami of historic suffering, and the breadth of the problem and the scope should be so calibrated. So, what are our demands? What are our strategies? What are our solutions? We'll ask our panelists to help answer these questions. How can we marshal our energies, coordinate our strategies and demands as we push to dismantle the criminal punishment system and redirect resources to the Black and brown communities that have been so ravaged and just don't have the word for it, ravaged by it? That's the focus of today's conversation, and we invite your voice. So we begin by inviting the panelists to introduce themselves and share their perspectives on how institutional racism and criminal punishment have affected their work. I'd like to start with Professor Gloria J. Brown-Marshall.
Thank you. And thank you, Kim Westcott. You've done an immense job here. I know you've been working on this for months, and it's so important that we understand just how difficult it is sometimes to actually bring together this type of panel to discuss this issue in the 21st century when so many people think we're post-race. Or if not post-race, then it posts the extreme problem. As was pointed out before, my name is Gloria Brown-Marshall, and I am a professor at John Jay College. I teach constitutional law, race and the law, as well as evidence, and I'm a member of the gender studies faculty. But before all that, I was a civil rights attorney. And I started off after clerking for a state court judge and a federal court judge. That was what I wanted to do. I took that class in law school that opened my eyes up, where before I was saying, why am I in law school? Then I took a labor class. I took a class on civil rights. I took a class on women's rights, and I said, law is what I want to do. This part of law I want to do, because I saw law then as a tool for social change. It was then that I started working in civil rights organizations. Then when I was in a lonely room in a little motel, really wasn't even a real motel, in a little town in Alabama as a civil rights attorney working on a school desegregation case, I asked myself the question, how long have we been doing this? How long have advocates been going into communities, talking to community members, coming up with strategies for change? How long have people been meeting with parents and coming up with ways to figure out how to make the system work when it doesn't want to work? So I decided I'm going to write a book. And I started off writing. I thought it would only be a couple of years, a couple of decades. Then I was into the 1700s. Then I was into the 1600s. And that's how I came to write Race, Law, and American Society, 1607 to present. And I realized it wasn't just criminal justice. It had to incorporate not just criminal justice, but the education system. Then I saw, what about voting rights? What about property rights? What about the civil liberties? What about the issue of immigration? And what about internationalism? So that's why you have all these chapters, because all of this is so integral to the racist point of view of a system that's not just the legal system, but the people who want this legal system to be in place. That's why it's race, law, and American society. We have to take into account the fault of the people who want to continue this system of the status quo. So from there, I decided that it's part of outreach to expand what I write and what I think into as many communities as possible. So I do other things. And, I have a BAI radio show. For those of you who are here from WBAI, I appreciate it. But all of this comes together in a way in which we can have a discussion, not just about what we've been through, but what we've been able to overcome despite immense odds. That's what I write about. That's my focus. And that's why I'm here today. Not just to talk about the problem, but how do we overcome that problem?
Thank you.
First of all, good afternoon. My name is Juan Cartagena. I used to study just down the block many, many years ago, and I am a proud recipient, all-star member of the affirmative action team. Because if it wasn't for the efforts of those institutions like Dartmouth and Columbia, I never would have been able to be exposed to that kind of incredible knowledge that the people around me and my professors had to offer to me. So I head up what's called Latino Justice Pearl Deaf. It used to be called the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. It's where I actually cut my teeth as an attorney a long time ago. And we deal with issues of race and law all every day. We address issues of institutional racism. But institutional racism, of course, is to try to deal with the issue of racism as if we didn't have any racists. And the fact of the matter is, in the Latino community today, as clearly as well in the African American community, there are still, unfortunately, and to our detriment, the incredible episodes, periodic, not so infrequent, of racist behavior, overt racist behavior. And for Latinos in this country to actually face the fact that we're facing a presidential nominee who actually calls 65% of us murderers and rapists, and gives clear license to people who use that kind of rhetoric to do harm, and yes, they have done harm since he said those words, physical harm. We address these issues from many vantage points. The amazing things that we have learned over time have been the ability to use the lessons learned in the African American community about how to use law as a tool for social change, how to use law to change those institutions that continue to marginalize all people of color, but especially Black and brown people. And as a result of those efforts and those lessons, I have been able to use the law similarly in the same fashion as Thurgood Marshall, in the same fashion as the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, in the same fashion that allows us to dig deep and address the root causes of marginalization, exclusion, but also being ready to pounce, and we have to pounce on state actors who actually use race as an overt weapon. I'll end with this opening comment with this point. Not too far from here in Long Island, New York, we represent multiple Latino communities who both suffer from police departments that refuse to protect them from a public safety standpoint. That means they're victims of crime and they ignore those concerns. And then at the same time, they go out of their way to target them for racial profiling and even what we call in Long Island stop and rob. That means they don't ask you for your license and registration down there. They ask you for your wallet, and it's returned to you about $100 later. So what we're talking about are police departments that are indicative of clearly entrenched cultures that have existed that created this incredible blue wall that permits both the complete dehumanization of a population with their public safety needs, but also is an active culprit in the racist actions today.
Thank you.
I'm David Jones. I'm president of Community Service Society. Before that, I was Youth Service Commissioner of the City of New York. I'm a lawyer. I clerked for Constance Baker Motley. But basically, I'm here as part of a family tradition of fighting this. My grandfather was a lieutenant for Marcus Garvey, trying to work on the White Star Line. My father was one of the early civil rights lawyers in New York. Actually, I got this picture that constantly reminds me of how much there's continuity here. It was at the Museum of the City of New York some months ago. And it's my father talking about the failure of the then district attorney of Brooklyn to bring an indictment against police officers who locked a man in a cell in Brooklyn and shot him between the cell door bars with the allegation that he was trying to escape in his underwear. But the worrisome thing, that was 1956. And it hasn't ultimately changed. The same kinds of disabilities are going on. And the outrage that was going on then is still going on today. That's unbelievable in terms of what we claim to be real progress. And I think Community Service Society actually, and Kim and others here got into this issue actually because of two early reports that we issued. One showing that black male labor participation rates had fallen below 50% in the city of New York. And the second, actually, the New York Times refused to print it until they sent their own band of experts in. It's not an unemployment rate, it's who's of working age who's actually participating in the labor force. And secondly, finding that New York had one of the worst disconnect rates for young people, 16 to 24. Not in school, not in work, essentially drifting. And basically the tinder for so many of the things we see going badly in poor neighborhoods, and the subsequent abuse by their controllers, the police. So that report raised a host of issues. Those reports, what was going on here? What was the theme of what was going on? And it almost touched upon everything that I think we'll look at tonight. It touched upon an education system that really fundamentally hasn't improved since the 1950s or before. The dropout rate, they keep claiming a little movement. We have a more segregated education system now in some ways. You've seen what Stuyvesant High School does. 7 or 8 African Americans, a handful of Latinos, and what's even worse for me, as a kid growing up in Brooklyn, we all aspired to Brooklyn Tech. 12 years ago, it had 31% African American and Latino. Now it has less than 10%. So in the midst of this great flowering of black and Latino and other middle class, the people left behind are in worse shape in many respects. Employment rates, in fact, were better perhaps in my time. Discriminatory, segregated black Brooklyn in some ways had better prospects for being able to raise a family and go on. And I think to go in reverse, particularly while we have so many achievements here, breakthroughs by black middle class, breakthroughs in science everywhere, of people launching all over the place when given a chance, to realize the base. People who are left behind, ill-educated, ill-housed, are doing in some ways worse in terms of their hope, is not acceptable. And I think that's what this audience has to start to grapple with. Just in closing, I think what I'm so concerned about, this movement has to be a movement that looks at political act. I was with William Julius Wilson 4 weeks ago, and his argument resonates. I don't say it nicely, I'm somewhat of a political hack. I want to see how we're going to move this thing politically. So under Richie Perez and other people know, we registered about 250,000 people through nonpartisan voter registration. It had impact. Sustaining it, however, and getting people to sustain it over time hasn't happened. What I'm concerned about, if we don't do that and nurture the political power that for people who don't have economic power and don't mobilize and don't use it, we're going to be another 50 years and I'm going to be dealing with another shooting through a locked cell door. And that's what this movement at Black Lives Matters, it's the engagement, particularly of young people, in a new movement that has to be refreshed. It really does. I've been part of so many movements now, and it's been a very dry time. And this has all the seeds and energy that we're going to need, but now it has to focus on the political movement and the economic movement that's going to be necessary to transform this, so we don't have to be sitting out around here when I'm clearly not even alive or in my electric wheelchair, when we're not talking about the same damn thing going on for yet another generation and another lost generation. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Kim, for inviting me. Good to see you again.
Very happy to have you.
I know we had a great conversation up in Albany last year on a multitude of issues that I'm sure we're going to touch. I want to thank the School of Social Work at Columbia University. My name is Walter Mosley. I'm the New York State Assemblyman from the 57th Assembly District, which represents neighborhoods of Clinton Hill, Fort Greene, parts of Bedford-Stuyvesant, North Crown Heights, and Prospect Heights. And I guess I'm going to just kind of piggyback on what Mr. Jones had noted, because I think I'm one of those seeds that has only been able to sprout because of his nurture and what he's been able to do indirectly for my life, and his father, who is still revered in the halls of the Assembly, the People's House. But before I go into that, when I was growing up, as most city kids, we go down south for the summer. And for me, I went to North Carolina, Plymouth, North Carolina, to be exact, where my grandmother was raised and went to college at Elizabeth Teachers College, which is now Elizabeth City State. And I remember every summer we would have to pack our car with food, and we would have to wrap it up in tin foil. And I didn't know why we had to do that. I was like, was my grandmother just that hungry? Or was my mom just that hungry? Until I got a little older. And then I realized that there was no guarantee that people were going to sit us. And we're not talking about, 40, 50 years ago. We're talking about, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. There was no guarantee that we were going to be able to, go to a restaurant and be able to use the bathroom. And that type of trauma is the trauma that my grandmother lived with all her life. It's the trauma that was kind of indirectly passed on to my mom. And as a result, I happened to see it firsthand as we took those trips back and forth to the South. But then we fast forward 3 decades later. My mom, a graduate of Morgan State University, who was a part of the civil rights movement as a student, transferred into me the need of service, understanding that my plight is unquestionably linked to the works and deeds of men like Mr. Jones and others who have made my life possible. Fast forward to me being now a member of the New York State Assembly, where since its inception in 1777 is the first time we've had an African-American lead the body, and Carl Hastie, my colleague and our speaker from the Bronx, who now controls, in part, a budget of $146 billion. Now, how does that impact us? As we know, the president, and I'll give you 2 examples. The president's My Brother's Keeper initiative, which he introduced in 2014, looking at the plight of black and brown boys, what we can do to end this systemic and perpetual level of failure and lack of achievement. Last 2 weeks ago, we were the first state to not only implement President Obama's My Brother's Keepers initiative, but to put our money where our mouth was and to allocate $20 million statewide for our attempts to deal with the issue of black and brown boys and what we need to do to give them the necessary tools to succeed. Another example as to what we're doing now as members of one of the most prestigious legislative bodies in the country is monies that we are allocating for our public schools, for our city universities, the millions of dollars that I'm sure you might have gotten most of it under the previous leadership, but clearly under the leadership of Carl Hastie, we were able to allocate well over $250 million. Whether you're talking about GEA funding, the gap elimination adjustment money that was used during the economic downturn, whether it was money for our CUNY and SUNY schools, whether it was money towards our public schools statewide. These are, to me, tangible results as to what we're doing now as legislators in terms of not only making our budget about dollars and cents, but really prioritizing what makes sense to us as a state and to those individuals who have been systemically excluded in the conversation as to where we're going to put our resources. Now, does that mean that we deal with every possible issue? No. Does it mean that we can magically make issues that are in real time go away? No. But I think that we're in a very unique time in New York State where you have men who look like me, who have access to people, who have access to resources, who can ask questions, get results, and ultimately get the funding. Now, another example, this was the last one, is Brooklyn Tech. When I got to the assembly, the issue was about lack of diversity, as Mr. Jones noted. And the question was, well, maybe we should dumb down the test. I said, there's no need to dumb down the test. When I was, I got accepted to Brooklyn Tech, I just didn't go because it was just too close to my home. And it's in my district. And my question was, what are we doing to give the parents and the scholars the resources to prepare for the exam, to understand the importance of the exam, because many of our students are not even taking the exam, nonetheless, are being prepared to take the exam. So what we were able to do, we were able to work with Brooklyn Tech, Stuyvesant, Bronx Science to allocate over $2 million in an effort to reach out to our middle schools to make sure that we properly train them, we properly prepare them for the specialized standardized high school exam. Those are tangible examples to me that speaks to what Mr. Jones had alluded to with regards to what we need to do now from a political standpoint. I read a recent article talking about how African Americans and Black and Latinos are becoming like the new establishment. But it's not about us trying to be a new establishment. It's about us trying to establish a new paradigm for how we govern and how we prioritize what is important and what is not important. Thank you.
Good evening. It's really great to be here. I really appreciate the invitation to be a part of this already phenomenal conversation. I think what is occurring to me most is not who I am, but who I am not, because I'm not a lawyer. Apparently the only one up here. I'm also not in a suit because I am a Ferguson protester, and I'm part of a generation that has very clearly chosen to wear our protest signs on our chests. And so I sometimes make the choice to carry that with me. And so I decided to make that choice today, coming from St. Louis and coming from my home, which is about 15 minutes from Ferguson. So yeah, I am a Ferguson protester. I am also the executive director of Teach for America in St. Louis. We serve about 20,000 low-income students in classrooms every single day. All of them low income, nearly all of them children of color, first-generation Americans. I also come as someone who tries to bring a little bit of protest everywhere because I was raised on the Eyes on the Prize series and the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, right? So Ferguson was certainly not my first involvement or engagement in the work of justice. But I specifically have worked to address issues of justice from the education angle because I'm very clear that justice will actually never come to be if we do not invest in leadership generationally. I am very clear that the first time I stepped into my own third grade classroom in Southeast Washington, D.C., I was engaging in a system that was never built to work for people that look like me or my students. And I have chosen to do that work because of what was proven to me on the streets of Ferguson, that some of the most fierce, courageous, brave leaders are actually under the age of 18. And they were the ones that led us out there. And so I found myself on the streets of Ferguson and then in some particularly unexpected places, because sometimes when you work for a certain kind of organization or you speak the King's English and you also are a protester, people can figure out how to help you build bridges. And so I'm also a member of the Ferguson Commission and the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, along with Jose Lopez here from New York, from Make the Road New York. And so have engaged in all of those ways over the last 18 months in particular in trying to make sure that the translation of protest to policy, to power, and back and forth, right? Because I actually don't think it's one directional. I think it intentionally has to be back and forth. Have been engaging in trying to make sure that we actually reach levels of systemic change and not just momentary change. That means that I'm also a part of an activist collective called Campaign Zero. 4 of us from Ferguson launched a 10-point policy platform specifically to end police violence in America. But we are very clear that police violence is the branch of a larger tree rooted in systemic racism and oppression. And as you said, Kim, there are lots of other branches: education, housing, employment, healthcare, et cetera, mental health care, et cetera. But when I think about this question about how institutional racism and criminal justice have impacted my life, it's not any of those kind of fancy labels that I think about. It's my time. I think about my time in the classroom, because being a 3rd grade teacher meant a couple of really important things. So as I said, I was in Southeast DC. For those of you who are old enough to remember, I was in Ward 8. So Ward 8 is the part of the city that former Mayor Marion Barry was a very beloved council member of until his passing. And I worked in a neighborhood with thoughtful parents, brilliant children, right? Really involved aunties, uncles, grandmothers, et cetera. But there were 3 things that were constantly working against us. One, as I said earlier, was that we were working and engaging in a system that actually wasn't built for us in the first place. Like, I usually push back on this language that the system is broken, because the system was broken. That means that it had to be working right in the first place. And for our kids, it never was, right? So that was always a challenge that was before us. But the other thing that I realized was that I was walking into the classroom, a Black teacher with a bunch of Black and brown students, having been breathing in the smog, as Dr. Beverly Tatum says, the smog of racism every single day of my life, internalizing that and not knowing all of the ways in which I was transferring that onto my students, right? So all of the ways in which I had internalized my own oppression, started to believe certain things about Blackness, about brownness, about poor folks, even though those are groups that I or people close to me belong to, right? And transferring some of those beliefs onto but 8 and 9-year-olds. And so that is one of the really distinct ways for me that institutional racism impacts my work. But most importantly, in certain states, if a 3rd grader does not know how to read at grade level by the end of that year, there is a jail cell waiting for him or her by the end of it. Because what we have essentially said is that if you are poor, if you are a child of color, that we can accurately predict whether or not you will be involved in the criminal justice system by the time you are 8 or 9 years old, right? All based on whether or not you can read. And 3rd grade is the year that technically you're supposed to go from learning to read, right? Learning fluency, learning words, learning how to put different vowel sounds together, to reading to learn, right? To moving to a place where reading becomes access to knowledge, access to power, access to information. And so sitting in at the intersection of all of those things as a 1st and 2nd year teacher trying to figure out how to do this thing meant that I had a whole lot on my shoulders. And that is the work and the burden and the responsibility of every single one of my students, of Shantae, of James, of Destiny, of Derek. That is the work that I carry on my shoulders every single day. That is why it is impossible to leave this work for me. That is why it was not for me to just become a full-time protester or just be a full-time educator, because I recognize the ways in which we are killing Black and brown students on the street and in classrooms every single day. And so I'm really excited to engage in this conversation and certainly looking forward to talking about solutions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so I would like to direct this question to Professor Brown-Marshall and to Juan Cartagena. And I'd like to just clarify what we've already been talking about, which is, what is institutional racism?
Well, when you look at institutional racism, you look at the words institution. And what is an institution? The institution can be something that's structured. So the structure can be fluid, but it's basically the government. And you say the government is made up of people, but it's a structure called the government. It could be banks. It could be the educational system. It could be the legal or court system. But once again, these are structures, but these structures are run by human beings. And so you have these individuals who have a certain prejudice or bias against certain groups, and they're able to practice it beyond their individual power, but practice it from the power of that institution itself. And I'll give two examples. And I think one has already been given about the education system. I've believed that for a very long time. As someone in the public education system, is something that we fought through, as opposed to something that we were just allowed to sit and receive the education. You had to piece through what you received to make sure it didn't do more damage than you were able to sustain. And we're talking about children having to sustain all of this and devise ways to get around their education. That's one way. But here's another one that hurt my feelings personally. And this was the banking institution. And the fact that under U.S. Attorney General Holder, banks like Bank of America, Countrywide, and other banks actually undermined the dream of so many homeowners by selling them bogus home mortgages, subprime loans, and ruining them as far as financially, ruining their capability to actually grasp any foothold into gaining wealth, because the home is the biggest measure of wealth in this country. And so to find these people now in foreclosure, find their credit score, the all-powerful credit score, ruined, and this wasn't the Bank of America is made up of all these people, Countrywide Bank, all these people, but in their hearts was such a horrific stain that they could use the power, enough of them, use the power of their institution in this mind think of, we're going to do this to brown and black people. And I always want to ask, this is why it hurts me personally, what joy did it give them? What sense of pleasure? What was the goal? So these are the questions that weren't asked. You can't ask these things. You want to. And so this and I had a white male, older white male tell me when the civil rights a long time ago, there's no meeting that takes place among whites to decide that we're going to discriminate. However, there is a mindset within the institution that says in education, I am going to, as a white female teacher, underteach the black kids. And when we get to the other questions you're going to ask, I want to talk about that, because it comes down to, how do you kill off the competition? And these institutions are killing off the competition. So that institutional racism, the power of the entity to do more than the individual against particular groups based on race. That's how I would look at it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. And Gloria's correct on every point. But think about it from the perspective of the victim, of the person who's marginalized and excluded. From the victim's that perspective, from the perspective of communities that are marginalized, does it really make a difference that the principal of the school is a racist? Does it really make a difference that the president of the bank is a racist? At the same level, they're being marginalized and excluded from the benefits of those institutions. Many of them are government institutions paid by the same taxpayer money that all of us contribute to. From that perspective, institutional racism is just basically the opposite, at least in the mindset of this society, that racism is hate. Or it's hate crimes, or it's animus, or it's purposeful discrimination. And from that perspective, you put those two things side to side, if you have generation after generation of African Americans in this country being excluded from the benefits of these governmental institutions, it really shouldn't make a difference if it's being run by the most liberal, progressive person, black, white, or brown. Mm-hmm. If it serves to marginalize and we don't get the benefits at the same proportion that we should be getting from any kind of measure, it results in exclusion. And that's the issue we have to tackle.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to direct these two questions to David R. Jones and also Professor Marshall. We've kind of touched on it, but again, it's more specific. In what ways has institutional racism affected the ability of Black Americans to participate fully in American society? Because it is structural, and so now I'm interested in hearing more on that perspective.
Well, one of the easiest ways is to look at what's happened in the Black community and also in the Latino community, that the civil rights movement did lead to a burst of growth in the middle class of both communities. Suddenly you had, in our community when I was growing up in Black Brooklyn, doctors, lawyers, all were in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Crown Heights. As the civil rights movement took off, and I tell you some of the people who talked about this, Clarence Thomas is the big arguer for this. When he was in law school with me, he used to all turn to the other black students, well, I'm the only person of the people. You guys got in because you were part of the black middle class getting everything. I'm the real, true adherent. The sickness, by the way, the sickness that impacts the white world has now, and I think Louis Gates in an article recently talked about it, there is an assumption of many in the black middle class at least, and you'll meet it, well, I was the one who had to get up and go to go off, and those kids who are sitting on there, they just don't have the kind of grit I did. And I had a yelling argument with one person on this issue because I said, I know who your father was. You had everything given. You were prepped to get many of the advantages that were fought and bled for in the civil rights movement, and now you claim that as a personal achievement. It's not. One of the arguments I have is the need for the black middle class, and that's why Black Lives Matter so much, to bring the educated who got the advantage, whatever way they got it, to turn back to the community. They have to. Amen. Because it's very difficult to organize without the firepower that we have developed in the black middle class. And if they don't come back in and turn and demand, it's going to be a very hard movement to win. And I think that's across the field. I think it leads to immigrants. I think there's a growing understanding that we need all the talents coming back to have an obligation here. So I'm talking around this issue, but the institutional racism doesn't merely stop, with white guys saying, oh, them. It's also permeated the very structure because of class now. And we have to fight on two fronts because we have not been able to get the reinvestment of the black middle class and the black achievers. They give $10 million to Harvard. I know one of the guys who did this, and nothing on issues of frontline issues because they want to be among the social set that they feel is appropriate. We have to start holding people accountable here if we're going to force this message through. Education obviously sweeps me along. I am so angry after we worked with the Inc. Fund on the issue of discrimination on the specialized high schools because it became apparent that only a handful of feeder schools, middle schools, actually get 85% get into those elite schools. So the discrimination starts when your kid is 4. You can spend $8,000 to prep your kid for the 4-year-old, enriched kindergarten program. I was talking to an administration guy to get the exam now, and I think what the Assembly does is wonderful. There's a whole industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars prepping children for one exam, and it's 20 hours a week, $8,000 to $10,000. This isn't not only discrimination against kids, black and brown kids. If I'm an Italian kid sitting in Bensonhurst, I ain't there either. So, but how this starts to emerge when you start to attack what's being done, which other school systems, Boston Latin doesn't do this. We have this exam, Dick Gottfried mentioned, he was on the floor when the original test system was set up for the specialized high school. He said on the floor they were talking, there has to be a preserve for white parents. Didn't turn out that way, but that's what they were talking about overtly. That exam is not normed, has no relationship to anything, doesn't have anything to do with what the kids are learning in school under the Common Core and all the rest of this stuff. It is a litmus test that is advantaged parents who either have the wherewithal or the intensity to provide this prep. And it leads then to a college system, a CUNY system now, where Baruch College has fewer blacks and Latinos than Yale and Harvard. What kind of garbage is this? So you start to see what everyone says, oh, no, we're in a liberal city and everything's fine. But when it comes to allocation of scarce resources that are important to parents, they leave our bodies in the road. And now it's become both race and class that's going on. And we have to forge a movement that recognizes the intersection here. As a matter of fact, and I'll stop. So I'm talking to my friend Darren Walker at Ford. No money. But Darren and I were talking about the problem of CUNY. We came out with a report showing this, and boy, did they dismiss that quick. But he said, yeah, you know, it happened at the University of Texas. They had to change. They basically saw that they weren't getting diversity. I said, oh, because of blacks and the Latinos? No, rural kids didn't have the wherewithal to get in. So they said, wait a minute, we're going to give preference to the top kids graduating from any high school in the state. Reversed it. Essentially, we have to start fighting almost trench warfare. Any of these abuses that come up have to be highlighted, and then we have to do something about it and make people who don't respond to it pay, at the very least, politically.
Thank you very much.
I like to say that this is such a sophisticated audience that we're not in Racism in America 101. And I say this to Kim a lot. We're not in 101. This is the advanced class. This is the 21st century. We know there's a problem. We know we're not post-race. We know that racism exists and it permeates every aspect of American society. It's been around since 1619 when the first Africans arrived in the Jamestown colony. We also need to know, and you already know, that it permeates education, health, welfare, athletics, housing, employment, anything you can imagine it permeates. But I want to touch on 3 areas that are maybe not the ones that you think offhand, and that is the spiritual damage of institutional racism, where we have young people who don't believe in their own freedom because they're being forced to. They're fighting against a system that's telling them they're better off incarcerated than they are free. Fighting against it. So we have that, the spiritual damage. We have the damage of a shortened lifespan, where even despite class, African Americans and other people of color have a shortened lifespan, some to up to 15 years shorter. I had a chance to be in the audience when the Social Security Administration was at my church, and they gave this information about retirement and certain things. It just happened to be this after church thing. They were fed us, so I was like, okay, I'll stay. But I didn't know what I'd be enlightened to hear, and that is the majority of those people who are in their early 60s decide to get early Social Security benefits, who are African American. Early. So they would rather start at 62 and 65. Why? Because they don't believe they're going to be around later on. So some as early as 59 under certain circumstances, but 62, yes. So this is despite class. These are people who are saying, yes, I could get more money if I waited, but will I be alive long enough to receive the money? And then the last thing we start the younger people, we have the seniors, we have those people in the middle. Women who are giving birth, it's been said that racism is now affecting their children in vitro, that they're stressed out in the womb. And that's leading to different types of diabetes, perhaps childhood diabetes and the rise in it. This idea of living with this constant stress is giving depression over. So then you have the eating habits. Then you have the obesity that leads to the diabetes. All these different things indirectly caused by the racism, institutionalized racism, and the stress of it all, of living with this. And then as an African-American woman, I'm living with the prejudice against being black and female, as well as everything else that we have to deal with. So it's not just those major categories we're always dealing with, but they have the color categories. And I'm just going to say, for those people who are immigrants, whether or not they're immigrants from Africa or the Caribbean, or whether or not they're Latino, the idea of this accent on top of it. So you have the color, you have the ethnicity, and you have the accent discrimination. And I'm seeing this happening time and time again, where people are thought of as not as educated or not as intelligent because they have an accent. But once again, aren't we just killing the competition? Right. What other ways can we undermine as institutions to keep white superiority and keep other people of color at the bottom? So how does this affect us? It affects our dreams and our aspirations. What can we become? I don't know anymore. With all of this that we can become, all these opportunities, and I like to say to people, and as I start off in the beginning, I write about and I speak about from the perspective of being a very proud African American. I enjoy being African American. I am proud of being African American. I enjoy my culture. Those are some of the most powerful words I think an African American can speak, because that means you didn't get all the way in my head yet. And
Yeah.
but there's this sense the institution is there to crush and to crush out, and it's been that way from the very beginning. When they took our religion, when they took our languages, and they institutionalized the second standard or second tier citizenship, that is what is supposed to be people of color. And the whole time it was meant for you not to like yourself, because if you didn't like yourself, you would help destroy yourself as they help destroy you as well. But the fact you have this panel here shows like the power of the human spirit. And that's what I write about, how we did fight against those laws, how we did stand up when there was no reason to stand up, and you knew the outcome was going to be your own self-destruction, and you did it anyway. That is the fight that we're in. That's why we have to, no matter what is being done, that institution, and I feel sorry for these children, because there aren't enough people telling them that there is institutional racism, and we're making them question themselves daily. And then that their aspirations as children are being crushed as young people. And we as adults should not sit back and allow our children to have their spirits crushed. One thing a friend of mine said, Jocelyn Compton Cooper, who was a social worker and a community organizer and activist who passed on in November, she said one of the worst things you can do, one of the worst sins, is to crush the spirit of a child. And we're doing this to our children of color. So what are the effects? Every aspect of life is being affected by institutional racism.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to direct this to, The next question I'm going to direct to Juan Cartagena, Assemblymember Mosley, and Brittany Packnett. And again, how has institutional racism affected Black and Latino communities? What are the similarities and differences?
There's no question that there's tons of similarities in the way institutional racism works in the United States. But of course, it's been much more entrenched and much more part of society's fabric in the Black community. It, of course, affects the Latinos who are also Black, Afro-Latinos. That's an indication of how the slave trade worked in this hemisphere, with the bulk of the slaves going into Caribbean and Central America, South American countries, with Brazil having incredible numbers in that regard, and sort of Colombia and the Greater Antilles. So those two things obviously overlap. And that, when you mentioned before, Gloria, the school to prison pipeline in Latino communities is also known as the school to prison to deportation pipeline. So the whole things are still very, very similar. But there's also some differences. The Latino community is extremely diverse from multiple countries, not all of whom see eye to eye on all issues. We share languages, a lot of cultural beliefs, and a lot of cultural staples amongst us. But Latinos only call themselves Latinos in this country. Everywhere else, we call ourselves Ecuadorians, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Colombians, etc. Two, we have to fight against the stereotypes of various things, including the level of non-citizenship amongst us. The far bulk of the Latinos in the United States, I mean the far bulk, like 66% or more, are native-born. The small number of people who are undocumented, numbering about 11 million, about 87% of those are from Latino countries, is significant. Those are big numbers, but that's also just a smidgen of the entire Latino population. At the same time, we're dealing with issues of long entrenched Latino populations. And that's the stereotype that I was talking to you about before. This notion that we have to deal with immigration issues, as that is the exclusive Latino issue. It belies the fact that immigration issues affect all people of color. It also belies the fact as if you can bucketize the entire problems in the United States society into just the immigration bucket, and that's completely wrong. I mean, my office is part of a team of attorneys on stop and frisk here in New York City. These are long entrenched Puerto Rican, Dominican populations that have been subject to this outrageous practice by the police in New York, which exploded in the Bloomberg administration. And they were all against long-standing citizens, multi-generational citizens who are Latino. So the issues are both similar and different in that regard. But I must say that we must address, foremost, how the society has created and perpetuated this institutional racism in the Black community. Doing so would elevate and actually resolve many of the issues in the Latino community, not 100% of them, but many of those issues.
Assembly member?
You know, there's it plays itself out each and every year. We're in Albany, where you talk about the distinction between institutional racism amongst Black and brown folks, how they differ, as Juan had so noted in regards to the immigration issue. Each and every year, we have a hotly contested debate about the DREAM Act, where we are talking about scholars who have done everything possible to make themselves eligible to go off to college and to matriculate in their educational career. But because of decisions that were made, not by themselves, but by others, we are going to punish the sons and daughters so that they can't go off to college. They can't qualify and get funding in an effort to pay for their college education. That is a clear distinction that not only impacts our Latin population in the state of New York, but our immigration population as a whole. So in my district, you're talking about folks from the Caribbean who live all throughout central Brooklyn. But where there are many of the similarities are quite obvious. But what's different now in comparison to 20, 30 years ago, or even 15 years ago, is that the rules are changing. And I think people are not understanding, as Sister Gloria was talking about, the psychological damage that's happening on folks when it comes to issues of how do we treat those individuals who are caught up on heroin and opiates.
Sure.
Not understanding that children have access to information and their parents lived in those times and days when we were talking about the crack epidemic and the heroin epidemic before that, and how we were so heavy-handed when it came to punishment. And now we're talking about treatment and how do we deal with the family. I was looking at Morning Joe, and Rob Reiner's talking about his film that's coming out this week, and how it was really it's a movie about him and his son, pretty much how they got through his addiction and how it impacted the family and how it impacted the community. Well, it also impacted our families. It also impacted our communities. But instead of us getting movies made of it, from a family perspective, movies were made about the dealer. Movies were made about the negative side of the drug epidemics of the 80s and 90s and 70s. And as a result, what was our plans as a community, how we were going to deal with it? We deal with mass incarceration. And I think that when you don't think that people are understanding that the rules have changed and you're still not doing anything to deal with it, that's when you talk about the psychological abuse that people have to deal with on a daily basis, because there's still people who are dealing with the ramifications of those errors in our city. But also it deals with voting rights. I had a conversation with a young lady that, I had to put in her place because she wanted to advocate for early voting rights. She wanted to advocate for voter registration online, voter notification online. And my colleague, who's a sponsor of a bill that talks about, in absence of any pre-clearance, federal pre-clearance provisions that are now non-existent because of the Shelby case, that we were going to have our own New York State voter provisions in terms of making sure that any type of actions that were taking place by the Board of Elections had to have some type of pre-clearance from the state of New York. Well, she said, well, that's really not a part of this package of legislation. That's more civil rights. We'll say, well, how do you think you got the voting rights? And so, so we deal with these kind of dual arguments, even from within like-minded individuals, where we have to kind of check people constantly. We had a colleague of ours in the state Senate, and I think he was well-intentioned when he talked about he wanted to increase penalties for those who are dealing in trafficking of guns, illegal guns in our communities. But we already have those books. We already have laws on the books that punish individuals who want to traffic guns in our state. So what are you doing? Are you adding to the problem? Or are you trying to find a solution as to how we can deal with this issue of the proliferation of illegal guns coming into our state and into our cities and our communities? So we constantly, as legislators, see it every day, how institutional racism has multiple faces, more obvious faces that are in opposition to what you want to do for your community and for your state, but the more subtle ones that, on their face, they look like your friend. But in reality, they're not. And that's where we as legislators get the stern face and we start pointing fingers and we start saying things that are not appropriate for legislators to say on the floor. But they get the point because today is a new day. And the only reason why it's a new day is because of men like Mr. Jones, who put us in a position, and his father, who put us in a position to check people when they need to be checked. And, sometimes it's not the most popular thing. It doesn't get the press right up. But that's how we're dealing with institutional racism in a more overt way, but more importantly, in the many covert ways that, we deal with each and every day. We're up in Albany or we are within our own districts.
The only thing I'll add, because I feel like we've gotten really clear on what the problem is. So Donald Trump came to St. Louis maybe about a month and a half ago. As you can imagine, I was out there with the sign protesting with lots of people. And I had the audacity to have my sign ask how you could love Jesus Christ and Donald Trump at the same time. Lots of people didn't understand why I found that ironic, but it was pretty clear to me. So that started a lot of conversation. And one of the people who wanted to have not particularly productive conversation with me was a black guy who had his Make America Great Again hat on. And so I'm like really trying with every fiber in my being to peacefully and calmly understand why, yo, bruh, why are you here? And he starts on this whole diatribe about how, America is, being destroyed and blah, 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 blah. And then he fixes his mouth to tell me about how Mexicans are stealing his job. Oh, boy. And I was like, so let me get this straight. You think that Mexicans, right, which we know is actually a euphemism for all brown-skinned people because some folks are too ignorant to understand ethnic differences, are somehow to blame for all of your personal problems. And that you, black man, have found the answer in Donald Trump. I was like, I just want to make sure I'm clear on the proposition here, right? But what it said to me was, not only that, rhetoric is real and rhetoric is real, but it also was a really stern reminder for me of something that I talk about quite frankly, and it is the challenge of a lack of solidarity amongst people of color, right? And I'm not just talking about black and brown people, right? I'm talking about our Native brothers and sisters. I'm talking about our Asian and Pacific Islander and South Asian brothers and sisters and non-gender conforming folks, right? I'm talking about all of the folks who, because they are not walking around in alabaster white skin, are dealing with the effects of institutional racism all the time, right? We're sitting here on Cinco de Mayo. My friend Linda Sarsour, who's from New York, who is Palestinian, tweeted, and I retweeted her, right? She was like, it's really funny to watch people talk about how Mexicans don't belong in this country when a bunch of this country was Mexico. What are you talking about, right? Right? And so she is a Middle Eastern woman. I am a Black woman. It is a day of importance in a particular community, right? And there is an opportunity for us to show solidarity to one another, right? Not to be anybody else's mule, right? Not to go and carry out the work that a community needs to do for itself, but to say, I will show up in solidarity and show up as your ally, recognizing that the thing people are really afraid of is if we all get together and figure out to stop fighting each other and start fighting the real enemy, right? Because the way institutional racism is set up is that it will continue, it will thrive, it will flourish if we keep fighting over the scraps of food at the table instead of realize that they're feasting in the other room, right? And so that for me is the greatest, I think, untapped opportunity of when we start to listen and learn from one another, understand what the unique challenges are, understand where there are similarities, respect where there are differences, stop trying to play oppression Olympics and say my oppression is worse off than yours, right? Because that's not actually how we build things, and get to moving together, right? So, yeah.
And I'll just comment because you've triggered all sorts of stuff. So I float through a lot of different things. I'm chairman of the Nation Institute. I float in a world of progressive New York. I have never seen a more divided progressive community in my life.
Amen.
And it is so deeply ingrained that we don't even notice it. You know, I was honored to serve on Latino Justice. I've led Black agency executives for 9 years, and now I lead one of the more progressive institutions in America. They're not talking to each other. They're lecturing to each other. This is what you should do, Latinos. You know, register this. Blacks, you should do this. But the notion of really having a constructive engagement of how you're going to turn around things for the benefit of the entire country now. This country is really teetering on a unique edge that goes beyond our suffering that I feel very passionate about, of Black and brown children and others. We're teetering with, you know, at least a flirtation with sort of proto-fascism and the notion that we can rip off the notion and start calling what are the sort of hidden discussions that go on within many of the ill-served white communities who are suddenly scapegoating Blacks and Latinos and Mexicans as if they're the reason that their children have lost opportunity. And I think that progressive agenda merging together is probably one of the things we're going to have to work on. The demographics of this country are changing like a shot. And the notion of one group being able to forge this movement alone, I think is ridiculous. It can't be done. And that's what I think we have to start discussing as we fix this program.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to ask the entire panel on this particular question. So how do we develop a set of political and economic demands that can begin to address the enormity of systemic racism? And maybe that goes in part to the movement building and also to the cross-coalition building. Yes, whoever would like to start. I guess I'd start with Professor Brown-Marshall.
Well, one of the things that I like to do, I'm also a playwright. I like to think of ways that we can go into different arena and how do we have a conversation in that arena. I truly believe in allies. I believe you make your friends before you need them. So that we need to be reaching out to one another. This divide and conquer. I had a 3-month exchange in England, and it was, scholar exchange. I was there for 3 months. England is such a small country. It's amazing how small this country is. Yet, what was the phrase? The sun never set on the British Empire. How was it able to control so much of the world through divide and conquer? It knew how to divide and conquer. And that is what was brought over in 1607 when the Jamestown colony was founded by King James. This idea of caste and divide and conquer. So continuing to divide and conquer. So in law, it would divide the poor white indentured servant from the servant African. So that if they got caught running away together, and this is a legal case, and I always say, I do this research in Jamestown every summer, And I like to go down there because in law, they write everything down, especially the Europeans. They love to write everything down like we would never learn to read or something. Okay, so I go down there and I read these cases. And as early as the early 1600s, there was a case of Punch, the white person who was the indentured servant, who ran off with the African who was a servant. They were caught and brought back. Punch received a definite number of years. The African, who was nameless and shows you the division right there, received lifetime labor as a punishment for running. This idea then was written in that says any indentured servant, meaning white, who joins with an African to escape or commit any crime will receive the African's crime, which will always be worse. So now, would you want to be that white person who helps the African, or you two have these joint interests, but it's making you say, I'm not going to work with him in this joint endeavor to escape or to do anything else because my punishment will be worse. This idea of the overseer what? By a smidgen, based on his whiteness, to be so much just a little bit better off than the African American or the African enslaved. Always this fight between the groups. But if we look at 1882, that's the Chinese Exclusion Act. Mm-hmm. The federal government passed a law, the first one to have a race on its face from the federal government, that excludes Chinese from becoming citizens. They used to have the same type of horrible treatment of Chinese in the 1800s after they called them all in here and then say, oh, well, how did you get here? We don't want you anymore. Sound familiar? Okay. And then started this conflict between the Chinese saying, okay, we're going to pay you a little bit more than we're going to pay the African Americans. Always this divide and conquer. So I think we have to look at it and say, how do we as a unified group envision freedom? And we might envision it in different ways, but I think there are going to be certain things that we envision that we want to do. So deciding how we want to advocate for freedom, we have to envision what freedom looks like, because without vision, the people perish. Mm. And it's the idea that we have to have this vision of freedom. What would it look like to wake up free and truly be free?
Yes.
How does that look? How does it feel? What would you need to do? You need to earn the same amount of money as whoever else is earning. Or, and I'm going to say this, to brown and white alike and everybody in between, what if I earned more than you because I'm worth more? I said this to a predominantly white audience with my husband in the audience. He was like, when you said that, I was scared. I was looking for the door. Because this idea that I am a charity case that you can help on occasion, as David pointed out, but then you're only supposed to go so far, and that's when you're supposed to stop. So your freedom has the limits I give it. So we have to look at self-determination. And that's the self and self-determination that people have a problem with. What does freedom look like with my children? That they should gain the education that they're supposed to receive. That my husband, who's African American, should be able to go to work and come back or do what he's doing, driving in whatever car he's driving and get there safely and get home safely. If he's done nothing, he should not be bothered. And when he needs help, he should receive it. When we start looking at our demands, that my life should be as long as anyone else who takes as good or bad as care of their health as I do. You know, that when I receive health care, it should not be seen through the lens of racism that I am viewing far too often. And that's what's happening. Another reason why black and brown people are not living as long, because when you tell the doctor you have an illness, they don't believe you. You know, it's like the same thing during slavery. You want to lie out of work by saying there's something wrong. Even today, they think you're lying about what's going on so you don't have to work. You have to also envision our political participation, as was pointed out. We should have the right to have our vote counted. And for many years, more years than I'd like to say, over 100 years, and I have a book on voting rights called The Voting Rights War, because we were treated like we were in a war just because we wanted to vote. So many people killed of color because we wanted to vote. So that's why I said envision freedom, and then take your day from opening your eyes in the morning and go through each level of what you have to do during the day, the groceries that you buy. Are you in a food desert? You have no fresh vegetables? So you have to have access to fresh food. All of these things, I would say that you'd have to sit down and actually categorize a day of freedom and what it looks like. And I would, challenge you all to do that. What it would look like to wake up in the morning free, and everything you do during that day be lived as a free, whole person, man, woman, and child.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is like the most affirming group. We like applaud after everything.
I'm delighted, yeah.
Beautiful. I love it. Thank you. I couldn't agree more about this process of visioning. And I often share with people that the first time I ever experienced true community vision setting was, believe it or not, as a member of the Ferguson Commission, right? So the governor appoints the Ferguson Commission after being perceived in the media and around the country as like wholesale not doing a great job with the crisis in Ferguson. So a lot of people felt like this was going to be like every other, I don't like to use the word riot, but every other riot commission, right? It's going to be the Kerner Commission. It's going to be just another report. This is dusty on a shelf somewhere. And then when there's the same problem happens in 50 years, somebody will blow off the dust and say, oh, this is exactly what they were talking about in Ferguson 50 years ago, right? Thanks to the leadership of our co-chairs, one black, one white, we were determined not to replicate that process. And so it was actually the first time that I had ever experienced in an institutional or bureaucratic setting, true, like I said, community vision setting and more equitable democracy, right? And so here's what that meant. First thing was that we did, it essentially followed a process of educating, sourcing, and implementing. Here's what I mean by that. The first thing that we had to do is recognize that as 16 commission members appointed by the governor, there was plenty that we didn't know. We were a group of exclusively black and white people, right? So there were lots of places where our community was not fully represented in our body. So the first thing we had to do was listen and educate ourselves. We did not set our own agenda. The community literally set the agenda. At the very first meeting, everyone got a keypad. Everyone voted on what are the most important issues that led us to this moment of not only the killing of Michael Brown, right, but the treatment of peaceful protesters thereafter. And the ranking of those votes became the agenda of our commission. So the first thing that was ranked was police community relations, probably pretty easy to guess. The second thing was municipal governance reform, because people had started to recognize through really important journalism that the over-policing that was being done in North St. Louis County, where I live and grew up, was tied very clearly to raising revenue off of the backs of people, right? So people were like, well, I don't know what all those words mean, but I know I need to fix this governance structure, right? The third thing was education. The fourth thing was the fourth thing was racial justice and reconciliation. The fifth thing was economic mobility. So not only did that literally set the order of our meetings, it also set up our structure, because then we had a working group dedicated to every single one of those things. Then we decided to choose inclusion and equity over efficiency. Now, let's be clear. Efficiency is a value of white dominant middle class culture. Right? That we have to move fast. I get it. Urgency is real, right? When I was teaching, I could not have a bad lesson back. I can't redo it. And these kids only have today, right? They don't have enough time in the classroom. I understand urgency. But if we keep choosing efficiency over actually including people and their voices and their power and their democracy, then we're going to keep quickly getting to the wrong answer, which is exactly where we are right now, right? So we had 60 fully public meetings. And when I say fully public, I not only mean that anybody who wanted to come could come, but they were all video recorded, they were all audio recorded, and they were immediately posted on the internet thereafter, right? Some of those meetings were full commission meetings, and at those full commission meetings, it wasn't just come up and kind of do your public comment for 2 minutes like we're very used to seeing at kind of city council meetings, et cetera, and then you go back and you sit, and then these people make a decision, right? We had public comment section, but every single full meeting also had small group conversations that were facilitated and asked 2 specific questions about whatever the issue of the day was. So if it was education, and the first question was, talk about your lived experience with this particular inequity, because we had to treat people's lived experience as just important data as statistics, right? And then the second question was, what solutions do you have for this problem? So we did not just use experts or the formally educated as our sources of ideas. Our sources of ideas were the people. And if you go to forwardthroughferguson.org right now, what you will see is a website divided essentially into two parts. One part is our report. So our actual policy recommendations that were sourced from the people after we educated folks and gave them language on the suffering that we were talking about, right? So we did bring in those experts and those academics who could help people frame what they were experiencing every day so that they had some real language around things, right? But again, the community was the source. So we've got all of those recommendations. They come through a very clear lens of racial equity because we were going to be unflinching on that commitment. We tested every single recommendation with the racial equity test before we approved it because we said if this is going to affect people of different racial backgrounds differently, then it's not something we want to pursue, right? The other half of the website, though, is actually people's stories. Again, emphasizing the importance of people's lived experience as real evidence. It shouldn't have taken a DOJ report for people to know how folks were suffering in Ferguson. We've been saying that for decades. We just treat the lived experience of people of color like it's not real evidence, right? If it doesn't happen to white people, if it doesn't happen to rich people, it must not really be happening, right? So the other half is people's stories, legitimizing, affirming people's realities, and letting them speak to how these recommendations on the report side would actually make a difference for their lives. Now we are in the process of building an organization called Forward Through Ferguson that is not a typical nonprofit. We are building a board of people that represent those same kind of people that source all of our ideas so that we can move into the implementation phase, right? I did not expect a riot commission to teach me that much about inclusive democracy, but it really has. It's the first time I've ever experienced it. It has deeply influenced the work that I do at Teach for America every day. It's deeply influenced a lot of the things that I do. But ultimately, there are ways to actually put pen to paper when people do their own visioning and do their own self-determined work. And I'll close with this. At this second to last Ferguson Commission meeting, there was a group that was standing up and people were really frustrated because there was a group that was proposing to help with the implementation process. And they had a slide where they listed the people in the community that they had talked with about their ideas. Nearly everyone on that screen was white, part of the establishment, nonprofit world, etc. And so someone from the back, who's also white, talk about allyship, he pipes up in the back and says, you know, when is this list going to change? And so, the person presenting says, well, this is just a beginning. We're just starting off. There are lots of people that are going to be added because we really want to hear from you. And he piped back up and he said, we don't want to be heard. We want to participate in decisions that affect us, right? People are tired of being placated, right? People are tired of saying, let's sit around this round table and let me hear your community input, your community engagement. Community engagement usually means you want me to use my face to vouch for the plan you already had.
Okay.
Right? I'm not doing it, right? So it is possible in a policy setting to actually set people up to make decisions about the things that will affect them, and then put time, money, and resources behind making those things happen.
All right.
Assembly member, would you like to come?
You got me following Brittany like that, but I'm very pragmatic. And I'm going to go back to the question. When I legislate, I tell people that this is a 365-day 7-day-a-week job. And I tell people that because I want them to understand that the difference between a moment and a movement is sacrifice. And what are you willing to sacrifice? As Brittany noted, the time that she spends and energy she gives is a sacrifice. She could be doing a whole slew of different things. But what she said requires a lot of sacrifice, giving of your time, your talent, your energy, taking away from your family, taking away from other things that you could be doing in your life. So to me, as a legislator, it's not about just sitting in the halls in Albany. It's not about sitting in my office. But I tell, when people come to me and advocate for issues and concerns and monies that they want out of the budget or appropriations they want out of the budget, I always ask them, what have you done from last year to this year that will bring about a different result. Because if you have not done anything different from last year to this year, do not expect a different result. And then they said, well, what do you mean by that, Assemblyman? Well, I said, what have you given up? What have you given up from last year to this year that's going to give you the end result you ultimately want? So for me, they always ask me, what have you done? And I try to give them the most recent thing that we did. So as you know, in the Assembly, we're controlled by Democrats, correct? And in the Senate, we're controlled by some hodgepodge, which is really controlled by the Republican Party, correct? Mm-hmm. So we knew that we had a presidential primary, but there were also it was a very important special election in Long Island. One of my colleagues, Todd Kaminsky, who ran for then Senator Dean Skelos' open seat, and he was running against for an open seat against obviously a Republican opponent. We as members of the Assembly knew how important that seat was for Todd. Not for that we like Todd. Todd's a nice guy. He's done well. He's only been in the Assembly for a year and a half. But we ultimately knew how important it was for Todd to get to that seat as a Democrat. Because ultimately, if he runs as the incumbent come November, we have a Democratic Senate come January. And that is the sacrifice that you have. So that means that me as an Assemblyman from Central Brooklyn, who only goes out to Long Beach if I want to, catch a tan or escape the city and maybe enjoy a summer breeze, so has to go out on a Sunday with Todd, with my colleagues, to go to churches. That means that we have to go knock on doors in neighborhoods that we don't know nothing about, other than that we know that Democrats are there. And that's the level of sacrifice that we need to have as legislators. It's not about just drafting laws and proposing policies, but it's actually going in the streets, whether it's in your own neighborhoods or in other districts throughout our state, to bring about the results that we need to pass progressive legislation. Someone asked me when I was running, well, are you a progressive? I said, I can be whatever the heck you want me to say. I didn't get the endorsement, but I was real. I said, it's not about the labels. It's about your actions and the outcomes. That will determine whether or not you think I'm a progressive. Not what I deem myself to be. Because there are multiple issues that I'm not a progressive. I'm very conservative on certain things. But to me, if we're going to change the paradigm, it comes from what you're willing to sacrifice in an effort for a movement that will bring about change, that will impact systemic issues that we see throughout our communities and neighborhoods and throughout our great state. Because I do believe that, someone said that, if people want to say that our best days are behind us, I say that they're looking in the wrong direction, because the best days are before us. My son and my daughter are going to grow up in a world where people are not going to know who they are, because they're part African American, they're part Puerto Rican, and they're part Korean. But I also tell them that that's not what you're living off of. You're going to be living off of what you do and what you produce as a human being in this society. And that's what you're going to be judged on. Not how you look, not how you necessarily talk, but that's going to help you in certain arenas, but what you're willing to sacrifice. And daddy's willing to sacrifice his weekends. Daddy's willing to sacrifice his time from mommy. Daddy's willing to sacrifice being in the community, to go out to Long Island, to spend my days and nights in an effort for us to get back a majority in the Senate so that we can be truly a government reflective of the people, for the people, and by the people. Thank you.
David Jones?
I think we'd like to start to get to how we make this movement whole, and this is going to have to be a discussion all over the place. It's not exactly on point, but I've always been intrigued with, okay, politically at least, how do you start to formulate a movement around some of this? I don't know if many of you have started to read articles showing the fastest growing death rate in America against trend is white men. White men who were not well educated, white men who are dying at increasingly high rates from suicide and drug addiction. And the Trumpism that's going on is basically using something that has been used on the divide and conquer thing that's been, I mean, this was the sharecroppers in the South being convinced that they were dirt poor, but at least they had something.
White.
They were white. And it led to early death, destroyed families, a whole range of things for that community. The question is, how are we going to be able to forge a consensus? And this is what Julius Wilson has been recently talking about a lot. Certain programs that have served the Black and Latino community particularly, like Social Security, despite, early death, and we're not taking full advantage of it, like the ACA, which basically has helped Black and brown and immigrant communities perhaps more than any other, but is seen as universal. A whole host of programs that we can sell in almost any community, but that ultimately serves our communities who are most in dire straits the most. So CSS has recently, focused on issues like a universal summer jobs program. And I took this directly from Julius Wilson. We looked at it. All across America, one of the reasons for this sharp rise in early death is a whole generation that is losing ground. Not only our kids, but American kids who don't have wherewithal across the country. And so I said, what happens if we came out with a program for every high school student, starting in freshman year, that they'd have a guaranteed summer job? The take-up rate in Riverdale drops like a stone. The take-up rate, I'm afraid, in Appalachia goes straight through the roof. But the take-up rate and opportunity of finally connecting a generation of African American and Latino kids to the world of work, both in terms of just money and a reason to stay in school because you don't see anything else, no hope, nobody working. I think we're going to have to tease those kinds of efforts out and demand of the Democratic Party, which I'm most concerned about, which has been using the vote of progressives, but basically driven itself into contention almost exclusively on the backs of blacks, Latinos, and immigrants. That's what this is about. I'm worried about the pivot. I've known the Clintons for a long time. I went to law school with them. I had an engagement. If we're not careful, we will watch this Democratic Party go running after white, center-right, white, working class votes and completely forgetting the base that elects them. And it's going to be a struggle because I know the discussions are already going on inside the apparatus, political apparatus. Well, what should we do now? We have to pivot now to deal with trying to grab back from Trump, the white working class. The danger of that is enormous. And we have to be there demanding, yes, you are our Democratic Party. You are our great hope, our wall against Trump, so to speak, which hopefully, we won't charge to Mexico. But those, sorry, that's sick. Sorry. But you have to have some humor here. It's the only way to survive. Frankly, it is the only way to survive. But I think we're going to have to deal with our own progressive movement, our own political movements, and make a demand that I can't turn out the kind of numbers that are going to be necessary to drive this effort back of unparalleled threat to all Americans unless we put things on the table that's going to immediately impact our future, the kids' future that we're talking about. And the danger of saying, well, we just can't do that. You know, we don't want to shake the boat now. I can't turn out the numbers we're going to need to take this party into victory and hopefully have some transition, which really affects people at the base, not only in terms of race, but in terms of economics. Because this is a society that's coming unglued based on a schism, an economic schism, that leaves people who don't have the access to lots of money or $8,000 for test prep sitting in a little town somewhere in upstate New York, and they're finished too. And what the Trumps of the world are going to do, say, well, that's not because the banks and everyone are creaming things over. It's because of those people, those immigrants, those blacks. You know, they're sucking up the energy. And if you just go along with our process, we can knock these people to pieces and you'll get all the benefits. They won't. Mm-hmm. But by the time they find out, mm-hmm. we'll be in ruins. Mm-hmm. And so will the country.
Juan Cartagena.
So there's a lot of lessons that we have to also learn outside the United States. A lot of lessons. I think just to touch on one of the biggest points I wanted to raise today was the war on drugs. Some of the most progressive voices on changing the paradigm of prohibition into a paradigm of treatment actually come from south of the border. Actually come out of Uruguay and Mexico and Colombia and the Caribbean. And those voices have been bold enough to come to the United States, the biggest consumer of illicit drugs anywhere in the world, to ask why is it that the war on drugs continues to be played out in the way it does with all this havoc within the United States of lost lives and lost opportunity and potential, and also so many dead people, innocent dead people throughout Central America. It's like 70,000 in Mexico alone. Outrageous numbers. So I've been looking at this because you really can't talk about the punishment industry without talking about the drug war, and you can't talk about poverty in the United States without talking about the punishment industry, and those things are all connected. I look at it from a very, very important way because I realize that I'm learning from these mothers who have lost so many lives throughout Central America. I see in their face the pain that they realize when they lost so many people. And I ask, and they ask the most simplest of questions. Don't you people in the United States, can't you use the billions that you spend on militarization of our countries and the so-called war of drugs? Can't you use it for your schools? Can't you use it for community development? Don't you need that money in the United States? And the answer is obviously yes. So in many ways, we are at a point now in which the face of addiction has become paler, especially when it comes to opioid abuse and heroin use. And it's everything you said, Walter, everything you just said, everything you said before about how we are looking at this now in a different way in treatment and compassion. I've lost older cousins to drug addiction. In my community, they're called tecatos, which is a very bad word. It's even worse than being called a junkie. And those people, no one asked them about their potential. They were just treated as the worst of the worst. And by the way, even by ourselves, right? Because in our own communities, we treated these individuals with the worst animosity. We are now at a point in which this entire drug war has not only failed on so many levels, but it's ridiculously failed. We're at a point in which the United States actually has about 4 states that actually produce and get involved in the actual production of at least one part of these drug wars. And we're at a point in time in which we have to look at different models. I'm not sure how many people in this audience actually knew that the United Nations was debating these issues about 2 weeks ago right here in New York City. The United Nations special session on General Assembly special session was on drug use, global drug use. And you see, that's why we have to deal with these issues in so many ways from a bigger perspective than just the United States and learn from the voices of change and progress, black and brown voices that are coming throughout the country. But we also have to continue to educate our population. There's a lot of us who don't know this. I mean, I work a lot to try to make the Latino voices in the United States, the Latino leadership, recognize that and connect to these voices from Central America, the Caribbean, and South America, because we don't even talk to each other and learn from those incredible voices. But we also have to educate our communities on so many levels. Everything we just talked about today is something we should be replicating in many settings in our communities, not just here at Columbia University School of Social Work. But the fact of the matter is, and that we are now at a point in which this implosion of the Republican Party, because that's really what it basically is in large part due to the leadership of the Republican Party not speaking to its own base. A base that, of course, doesn't recognize that the benefits of this one president, the first black president of the United States, actually benefits them. This whole notion that they can be against the Affordable Health Care Act, even though they receive incredible benefits from it. The notion that they probably believe that the country is still running some deficits and that the Obama administration has done nothing to alleviate it, completely belied by the facts. In many ways, our movement to address the punishment industry has to also attract those votes. It has to be able to attract the most progressive white folk to understand that it is not only bad from every angle, moral and otherwise, to allow racism to operate the way it has, just bad from a perspective of policy and dignity. And the restoring the dignity of our people, especially the dignity of our workers, many of whom are invisibilized by the hate that exists in this country, inures to the benefit of all of us. And in many ways, we have to be able to do that and restore that dignity in a way that allows us to really capture this notion of our inclusiveness in this country. I find it really, really troubling to recognize that this whole disparity between what we can do as a people, and the potential that we have as a people, and this outrageous notion of otherness in this country. And Brittany, you said it before. I mean, the fact is, we all get together, we can build this movement better. But let's not forget, we also need progressive white votes.
Yes.
We need progressive whites to actually be recognizing, actually, that this issue of racism and institutional racism is the worst thing that can happen to our collective progress.
Right. That's right.
I think we got to fix that soon.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to want to try to collapse a lot of questions on punishment because I'm afraid that we're getting very close. And it seems like we all know that there's a problem with the punishment system, and we know that it's very connected to race, and it's connected to black people and brown people. So I just want to ask, is it time for a paradigm shift? And if there is a paradigm shift, what would that look like? And I would just briefly ask everyone, if we would move away from punishment, what might the system look like?
Here's the thing, from a historical standpoint, and as I told you, I research and write about legal history from a racial perspective. Two major things. One, it wasn't all about punishment. People talk about eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, which is Old Testament. If you're a Christian, you're supposed to believe in giving a second chance and the ability for people to change their ways, and also that the soul is not for you to judge. Those are the things that kind of gotten lost. In history, you had this Quakerism of punishment, where the Quakers thought you would put somebody in a cell and give them time to think about what they've done wrong and to reform. That's why it was called a reformatory. And the penitentiary was to become penitent, you know, and spend your time being penitent, thinking about what you've done before. However, the sense in the 13th Amendment, which was the abolishment of slavery, and you can read it yourself in the 13th Amendment, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery except for punishment for a crime, except for punishment for a crime. So when slavery ended in 1865, it triggered the convict lease system. So those same Africans who were trusted to watch over Miss Mary and Little Mistress while the master was gone was now seen as this corrupted body who could not be trusted. By 1870, when we have the 15th Amendment, because we've already been given the right to citizenship, which we must understand, the right for citizenship at birth was something that was given to the Africans first. In 1868, with the 14th Amendment, the Africans received citizenship at birth because we had been here since 1619. And I always like to tell my students, keep a list of things that Professor Brown Marshall says I don't believe I'm going to look up later. So please look that up later, and you'll find, yes, 20 Africans arrived in the Jamestown colony in 1619, and the colony had just been formed in 1607. the Mayflower landed in 1620. We were here before the Mayflower. Please understand, make a little note for it, look up later. Okay, so the criminal justice punishment system began with the free Africans who were in the Jamestown colony, figuring out ways to kill the competition. How do you maintain your superiority against people who arrived after a 5 to 6 week journey in the hold of a slave ship from another country, not speaking the language, the culture of being different, everything, arrive on the shores of Jamestown colony, look around and say, I'm going to do this. So we had Mary and Anthony Johnson, the first black couple, sorry, Michelle and Barack, but Mary and Anthony Johnson in the early 1600s not only had a farm, they had money and they had servants, white and black servants in the early 1600s. And what did they do to undermine that? Yep, right. Mary and Anthony Johnson, Jamestown colony. They changed the law. And this is what happens all the time. You talk about the paradigm shift, that when people of color, and especially, thank you so much, Juan, for pointing out, if the progress affects African American, then that rise in tide will shift all boats. Because as Lonnie Guinier pointed out, we are the canary in the mine. If it happens to us today, you'll be dead tomorrow. Okay, but here's the thing. As soon as Africans in America began the progress, they changed the law and created chattel slavery. And then running away from enslavement became a crime. Being enslaved was the law. So when we're shifting here, it's with the idea of, and I take away racism and put in the word greed. And then you begin to see legalized greed. How can I make the most profit? By not just taking away how much I have to pay you, but saying you don't get to earn anything. And if you don't work for me for life for free, then you are a criminal. So when we start to look at our criminal justice system, when it gets to 1865 and they've gotten all this free labor for generation, and now say, now you're free and we can't get anything more out of you, there's got to be a way we can control you, and there's got to be a way we can get the money we wanted before, the things we wanted, the labor we wanted, the convict lease system. Because slavery is only abolished except for punishment for a crime. We will create the black codes, criminal laws that criminalize everything you do. Sound familiar? So this practice that we're in today, they had plenty of time to get that really refined from 1865 going forward. The first black U.S. senator was Hiram Revels in 1870. In 1870s, we had black U.S. senators. We had black U.S. representatives. We had blacks in state government. And then they changed the laws, and they allowed individual discrimination to be something that the federal government could do nothing about. That's why when you go forward into 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, that's why you had to have all those things happen. It's 100 years later. And then what happens? The Rockefeller drug laws. And they start this war on drugs that we've talked about before. So every time we start making this progress in 1960s with the civil rights movement going forward, you see this shift into criminalizing black people. How do you undermine their progress and keep yourself on top economically? That's legalized greed. And see, even now when we go forward, we're looking at this mass incarceration. The mass incarceration, you can say, okay, we've given whites in upstate New York homes based on the prisons that are placed there to replace the manufacturers that went overseas or went to the Southwest. You have black people rising up. What else can we do to keep them at the bottom so that we can maintain our economic superiority? So whatever paradigm shift, just understand there will always be a backlash, or as we like to say, a blacklash. So that there's nothing that's going to be permanent we devise. We always have to be on our toes, vigilance. Now we say, Thomas Jefferson said, you have to be vigilant. So if Thomas Jefferson felt he had to be vigilant, how vigilant must we all be? So whatever that paradigm shift we do as far as criminal justice, know that it has to be something where we're always watching for the next shift. They legalized marijuana possession, right? Legalized marijuana. So these black kids who are in prison for marijuana, and now you have white people becoming millionaires selling it in Colorado and other places. The shift happened, and where were we? So if we don't form this catalyst of protest, litigation, and legislation, working constructively together with something in mind that not only that we have a goal, we know what freedom is, but we're ready and able to shift when the backlash comes. If not, because they will assassinate our leaders, they will undermine our progress. We need to learn from what's happened in the past so that when the shift comes to our shift, we can shift again and we're not stuck in our same dimension of this is what's going to work all the time, because it's not.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Just because of time, very briefly, everyone else, if you'd like to comment on that question.
On the paradigm shift
Please.
in punishment?
Yes.
Well, throughout the country, there's been slightly increased numbers of people being released from prison intentionally by various states. There's also been a slight dip in the total number of people incarcerated in the United States. But given the highs that we had to experience for a long time, this is not nearly significant. The shifts are pretty alarming. One is the privatization of prisons. Mm-hmm. It's this notion that that the United States federal government actually contracts with private prison companies who will make, by the way, whose investment on Wall Street is amazingly high. There's money to be made here. And the federal government actually guarantees 34,000 beds to be occupied every day with immigrants in detention centers. 34,000 beds must be occupied. Anything less than that, the federal government pays a penalty. The incentive, of course, are clear. But then the next paradigm shift is going to be, so now we have more people released. So the same companies that used to build prisons and are now recognizing, oh, damn, the numbers may go down over time. How about if I just invest in bracelets? And how about I just invest in all kind of other forms of criminal justice supervision, which doesn't necessarily mean people inside a prison cell. And those opportunities are on the market and they're clear. We've gone through so much differentiation in many ways. You would think that one paradigm shift would be for juveniles. We have seen some progress in that regard. The level of brain science, as we know it today, is much more accepted. We understand that maturity in the brain happens at a much later point in life for these individuals. It seems to have worked, that kind of brain science seems to have worked to reduce the reliance on juvenile incarceration everywhere except the state of New York, where we still criminalize behavior at the age of 16, along with North Carolina. And where the best thinking about how to change that shift has been given to the governor's office, Governor Cuomo, this particular governor. As recently as a year ago, I was on a commission, 37 recommendations. He adopted each of the 37, and it never moved more than his first attempt to try to get it done a year ago. We still incarcerate and treat as adults children, because that's what they are, it's children, knowing very well that everything we know about neurology and brain science says the opposite. So Gloria is correct. The science may be there to create a shift in how we deal with punishment, but the politics are still the politics.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I think we've heard some of the real in-depth things. I've always been focused, and we're still focused on the issue of both education within prison walls, essentially the third grade average for many people coming out of incarceration. We have the fifth highest recidivism rate in the state of New York, and we're pumping people out who are subjected to a kind of civil death. They ultimately can't get employment. And it has a destabilizing effect, obviously, on the individual, but it also leads inevitably of people with no visible means of support, limited education, inevitably preying against their own communities, the elderly and the weak in their own community. Clearly, one of the ways to go about this, and I joked with the Attorney General about this, I said, we wipe out all physical education at prisons. only 12, 24/7 classes. With each time you pass a particular roadblock, you get reduction of your sentence. And I said it as a joke, when I'm running at Nostrand and Fulton at the age of 68, I want a very fat but very bright guy trying to catch up to me. The whole notion of I'd much rather these guys becoming the new Milkins of the world and making money like all good capitalists do by ripping off all sorts of people financially, than having them prey upon elderly and young people and turning because they ultimately feel so constrained there is no other way to make a living. So I think this notion of turning around what they took away, actually, the fact that we're working, Rob and others are working on trying to bring back college education inside the prison so that at least we start to have the realistic idea that once people are incarcerated, the easiest way to get out early is achieving educational excellence. And the fact that you have nothing else to do but get educated, other than, and most people don't have, major neurological problems. They haven't been educated well. They're going to be a flowering, obviously, of people who take the potential. And that's the kind of paradigm shift I think would be necessary to happen. And it hasn't happened in New York State yet.
When Andrew Cuomo took office, one of his major goals was to close down our state prisons. It was his father who created an industry in upstate New York where you did not only have the prisoner who was the ultimate target to be punished, but now that as we close down these prisons, we find communities who were imprisoned within these prisons in which they surrounded, who now feel as if they've been abandoned. And as a result, we have swaths of communities throughout our North Country, Finger Lakes, upstate New York, Capital Region, that are really ghost towns. And as a result, we have not only damaged communities, primarily zip codes, 4 or 5 zip codes in New York City, who are the pipeline to this industry. But now that we're closing off this industry, we've now created the same destitute that we see in some of our own districts here in the city in the downstate region. To me, that's punishment on multiple levels. You might not even have spent a day in prison, but your family might be punished because of this paradigm that we're living in. Your husband or your son or daughter might not be able to get a job because there's no longer a prison industry in your town. Small businesses are closing. Schools are not being funded properly because there's no industry that has now been ripped out of certain communities. And as a result, we not only have now impacted tremendous communities that we all grew up in Brooklyn, in the Bronx, in Manhattan, in Queens, but now we've done the same to a multitude of communities throughout our great state. And to me, I think that that is the ultimate form of cruelty when it comes to punishment. When someone who doesn't think they're being punished ultimately becomes the ultimate victim, and they don't know what to do. And I think that we're in a time and place in our state that we parallel what our country is going through. We represent 5% of the world population, but 25% of those who are incarcerated. And now we're starting to think about what is the cost-benefit analysis of all of this incarceration. Does it make us spend too much money on punishment in our criminal justice system? And henceforth, do we neglect other things like healthcare and higher education and so forth, and pre-K to 12 grade education? Those are the things that we're struggling with, and whether or not we can weed ourselves off of these things in an effort to make sure that we set forth a new paradigm, which we're not so heavy-handed on punishment, but on growth and capitalizing on our potential as a state.
Thank you.
I'm going to go quickly and apologize ahead of time. I have to slip out at 8:15, but this has been a really fruitful and thought-provoking conversation, so I really appreciate it. When I think about the necessary paradigm shift, especially when it comes to children, the paradigm shift has to be from one of control and compliance to restoration, creativity, and freedom, right? So I had the academically great advantage of going to private independent schools in St. Louis because both of my parents had advanced degrees and were also educators and knew how to work the system enough to find the scholarship money to meet where the salaries ended and get myself and my brother out of the system that had actually educated my mother in St. Louis. And so I never, ever encountered police officers in my schools, ever, right? Ever. And I went to school with kids who did cocaine, right? It's not that there was no crime going on in my school. It was just that I was in the neighborhood and going to school with the kinds of kids that you don't stick with the police officers on them when they've got a problem. You do any number of things, right? So I am a firm believer, and a lot of people actually really surprisingly debate me on this. I'm a firm believer that police officers have no business in school buildings, right?
Yeah.
And people are like, well, what about violence and what about all these other things? There's a charter school in Boston that is actually an alternative school. So every single student in there has been in some stage of the criminal justice system, and there are 0 police officers in this school. There is no violence in that school. It is a rigorous learning environment. It is a rigorous social environment. It is possible, again, about this vision, right? If we allow our vision to be limited by the fact that we've only ever seen traditional public schools and some charter schools in large urban areas have police officers, and that's the only dream we allow ourselves to have, then we'll keep on perpetuating it, right? But if we actually allow ourselves to dream bigger, we can we can challenge our legislators, we can challenge our school administrators to set a timeline for when they're going to rid all of our public schools of police officers, right? And how do we do that? We also get about the business of ensuring restorative justice and engagement in schools, right? There are actual tools out there for this. We don't have to go create it. We don't have to just be brilliant people and figure out how to make it up. It's been done, right? It's just about having the will politically, socially, and academically to actually invest in making those things happen, to training teachers, resourcing schools, and developing student skills in order to be able to do those things. The last thing that I will say is that actually I think Red Hook's community justice center out here is a really great example. So it's something that protesters in Washington, D.C. have actually been looking to, because there was a crime spike back where I used to teach in Southeast Washington, D.C. The current mayor of D.C. came under a lot of heat from the activist community because her solution was to flood the area with more police. Now, a bunch of those activists were saying, I actually feel less safe in my community with more police. Let's have that conversation, right? But also let's have the conversation that if you are tracking this spike in crime to returning citizens, so people who were once incarcerated and are now returning home, the problem is that the idle mind is the devil's play shop, right? So if you actually put folks in training opportunities, if you put folks back in school, if you put folks in employment opportunities, who's going to have time or need to go and commit crimes, right? There won't be lack in their lives such that they have to go and commit crimes. And then we will have reinvested in the community instead of flooded the community with overzealous policing that we've already got, right? So again, it's all been done. It's about whether or not we're actually going to step up and do the things we know work.
Thank you. All right. Okay, now, we have very little time. I am so sorry that we had to start late, but I want to give the audience a chance at least to respond. Come up to the mic. I see someone who's incredibly enthusiastic. Come on up.
Hi, I'm Rob Carmona. I have so many feelings right now. For purpose of the transparency, I have a lot of history and connection with I'm trying to remember when I met Dave, and I remember it was 1981 when I was at United Way. So we go back a long time. Juan was my younger daughter's professor at Rutgers. She's now a practicing attorney. I'm currently working with Kim. And so much of what was said here, and it's going to be not going to be a question, it's just a comment, or two, actually. When Gloria was talking about freedom and what it means to be white, I remember, I went, when I was still running Strive, I had went and got a car, and I didn't put any money down. And one of my staff said, wow, you rolled in and rolled right out with a car? I said, yeah. They said, damn, you must have felt like a white boy. And I was like, wow, I didn't think about that, but that's how they feel. Every single system that you guys mentioned, I was accepted at Brooklyn Tech. I was there for 2 years. They couldn't kick me out for scholastics, but I was always beating up white kids in Fort Greene Park, so they finally got me out, right? The system of criminal justice, and you spoke about the prior heroin epidemic, got caught up in that. Every system, including being a graduate of this school. The thing that I want to really say is this body of people here at Columbia, and I think Gloria said it, that we're speaking to a room of like-minded people, people that really get what we're doing here. And I would posit that, and I know everybody's busy, if we could take this same bunch, plan it out, and take you guys and gals out to the boroughs. We should be in Bedford-Stuyvesant having this conversation, right? We should be in the Bronx having this conversation. I know I've been speaking with Judy, and one of the things we're talking about is taking the show on the road. One of the things that people like myself, Sam Arroyo that's sitting in the back, and other people here that kept our careers, and David knows this, in the hood, so to speak, can serve as filters or code switching for the body of work and that you guys are putting out there, right? If you do it in the hood, and then people like us that work in the hood can now translate that. And I will close this by saying, you know, we're in a Trumpian time. I do thank him because now nobody can deny what race has done. And there are times over our 36 years, Dave, that we've known each other, and I'm looking at Dave like, we're still here. But you, Brittany, and I saw your bio, 30 years old, you give me hope. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, people, if you want to make a comment, if you want to say anything very quickly, we're going to wrap this up, and I'm so sorry we have to do it so quickly in about 2 minutes. Anyone else with a comment? Yes, ma'am, come on up. Oh,
Hi, Madeline Villanueva. And I actually have 2 questions. You don't have to answer them both. But there seems to be a pretty large intersection between the conversations we're having here and conversations around how we may be able to change and explore a different economic model, because it seems like this is, in part, to paraphrase what you said, is sort of an economic strategy that is in place. So if there's some way of intersecting those two. And the other is, you spoke of not allowing the Democratic Party to sort of start this pivot. And there's this professor at Princeton, Professor Glaude, espousing leaving the presidential line blank. Wondering what views may be on that strategy and just voting more locally.
okay, thank you. Anyone want to take that question?
I'll take this first one. I mean the second one.
Okay.
In regards to that movement, and for full disclosure, I'm a Hillary delegate. I was also a Barack Obama delegate in 2008 and 2012. There's one thing when you want to make a point, and then there's another thing when you want to make a difference. And to me, I think by leaving that blank does a disservice to anyone who led you up to this point in time to be in that voting booth, and the sacrifices and the lives that have been lost. People who were on voting lines who were shot. The next man came up, shot. And these are things that were pervasive throughout the South and sometimes in the North. And you have to understand the historical context by which you're able to vote. Now, I'm not saying you should not do that. That's your prerogative. But to me, if you want to make a difference, you need to continue to be a part of that conversation. That's why I applaud the senator from Vermont. for what he's doing in terms of shaping the platform, because no one's bigger than the platform.
Right.
No one's bigger than the party. I don't care how many presidents are in your family. I don't care how many people you're going to want in your family to be president. But at the same time, I would not want to do anything that will contribute to the possibility of a President Trump.
No.
And that's the bottom line.
Right.
Yeah, I'm gonna add to that really quickly before I slip out. I always vote for that express reason. I personally cannot allow my vote to help allow a President Trump exist. But I have so many people in my, like, who I'm very close with who are still like, I really don't know. Like, I really don't know what I'm going to go do. And I know and these are not people who are going to go and vote for Trump, right? They're people who might leave the line blank, who might write something in. But it has been, I have sat at 2 tables with Secretary Clinton and 1 table with Senator Sanders, specifically discussing issues of race and this movement. And I left with continuing questions for both of them, right? So when the primary came to Missouri, I showed up at I haven't told anybody this, and here I go. I showed up at my polling place because I can't not vote. And for the first time ever in my life, I voted undecided. It hurt my heart. Because for the last 2 cycles, I was like, clearly I know who I'm voting for. I was like in, right? I was committed. And so I think at the very least, we have to be very serious about electoral reform, right? And recognize that if we don't want to be in this moment again, then we have work to do, not just for 2016, but for every single election cycle after this, right? Because when we're talking about a 2-party system with an electoral college where the popular vote doesn't mean much, right? That is helping to lead to the problems that we're dealing with now. And a lot more people are finally becoming aware of that fact because we're finally being backed into a corner. And so I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that I know the answers for 2016, right? And I laid down my head and I'm really scared about 2016. And yet I am very clear about what we have to do looking ahead to 2020 and 2024, et cetera.
Well, can I just make one little quick comment? As I told you before, I wrote a book. I wrote this book titled The Voting Rights War for this very reason, to remind people of the martyrs who died trying to get us the right to vote. Even the right to vote in a way where we're probably not truly decided on who we want to have in that office, but the fact that we have the right to make that choice. People died for us to have that right, and they're fighting in court. People like Juan and so many others are fighting in court for us to have this right to vote. It is not something that we should just do as a protest and not vote, and then that does undermine the sacrifice that went into their right in that right to vote. And secondly, I wanted to touch on something about community justice that Brittany pointed out before she leaves. Community justice is something that would be that paradigm shift. If we look at what happened in Rwanda, if we study what happened with Rwanda after the genocides there, they instituted community justice courts in Rwanda. It's something that has been tested before, and can we do it here now? The last thing I just want to say, if you run out of time, and I know we don't have enough time, please read the essay written by Kim in here. It is so well written. It is so informative. And I think it's so important to read it. And each one of us gave our different books and things that we would want to have people read to know more about this. And so that's something else that you can read that's part of our bios. But this essay by Kim is exceptional.
Oh, gosh. Thank you very much, everyone. All right. I'm so sorry that I have to wrap this up so quickly. I just can't tell you how grateful I am to the panel. Thank you, everyone, to the panel. They've been fantastic educators in this process. And mostly I want to thank just everyone at CSS, at Columbia. There are just about 1 million people that I would want to thank individually, but you've been here very patiently, so thank you. Have a good night. Keep in touch. We want to do more of these forums and have more of these conversations, so please stay in touch with us. Thank you.
I didn't know you were a professor here.